تنسوا الاعجاب بالفيديو والاشتراك في القناة.
I think we're going to jump right in here because, we covered some really good ground in the first episode, but maybe you could just summarize some of those thoughts as we begin to look today at the archaeological evidence for Hatzor.
Yeah, that's good, Scott. In summarizing our last episode, I want to encourage people, if they didn't see it, they can go to our YouTube channel and watch it, or on WBPH's Vimeo channel, part one about Hatzor. But here's the summary. We're going to put this up on the screen. So Hatzor was one of three major cities conquered and burned by the Israelites, okay? So in the conquest, Jericho, Ai, and Hatzor. So fires are always a great thing to find in the archaeological record, and you want to look for that if it's recorded in a text like the Bible. Hatzor was a very important city in the northern part of Israel. It was a huge city. It was on the trade route connecting the two continents. Very important in antiquity. Goes way back into the Amorite period before the conquest, several centuries. Significant site. The name itself is mentioned in numerous texts outside the Bible, the Amarna letters. It's called Hatzura, actually, in the Amarna letters. A Babylonian tablet with the name of the king, the Mari texts, Egyptian execration texts. So a number of different texts mention Hatzor. And then as we transition here now into more specifically into the biblical narrative and the archaeology related to that, we have Joshua 11, which mentions its conquest and burning. And then we have Judges 4 and 5, which talk about the defeat of the king and his armies, including his general Sisera. It doesn't explicitly mention that the city was destroyed, but a destruction of the city would be consistent with the defeat of the king.
Yes.
And so we're going to explore those items very specifically today.
Yeah. And since God told them to burn the city, we have to assume they burned the city.
Right.
And there was a complete destruction there.
Yes.
I think it would be great for our audience today just to understand, you mentioned now in this conquest structure, we mentioned Jericho, Ai, and Hatzor. And
yes.
we're gonna be entering into the discussion on the archaeology there. It's important for our viewers to know that ABR has specialized in the study of conquest cities. Dr. Bryant Wood's research on Jericho was groundbreaking because it revealed some of the problems with Kathleen Kenyon's research. And of course, we're not going to talk about that today, but that's important. And if we dug at the city of Ai, and so now we're talking about Hatzor. You dug there for a season. One of our former staff members, Gordon Franz, dug there for many, many years.
Yes.
So we have a lot of experience here. So as we zero in on Hatzor and the archaeology, we've put a lot of pieces together here. We have a grasp of this, and we're hoping our audience today will get a better grasp of Hatzor. Now, we're talking about the archaeology. We've talked about the biblical accounts. Now we're talking about the archaeological evidence there. Let's launch into that, Henry.
Yeah, sure. So two major excavations at Hatzor, one by Yigal Yadin, the famous Israeli archaeologist, and as I mentioned in the last episode, also a very famous military general in Israel history. What an incredible life the man had, if you go online and read about his biography. And then Amnon Ben-Tur, who was a protege of Yadin and is now the excavator there at Hatzor and has been digging there for many, many years. So what both of them have found, the big picture of it at this point, are two destructions. One dated to the 15th century BC, and another destruction of Hatzor in the 13th century. So when we look at that, we ask the question, okay, we have the biblical narratives over here, we have the archaeology. Does that work? Does it fit together? Do they correlate? Now, in the Joshua narrative, we have a very explicit mention that the city's destroyed. So when we find evidence that correlates with that, that's a pretty nice fit. In the Judges narrative, it doesn't say the city was destroyed, but if the city were destroyed, it would be consistent with the defeat of the king.
Yes.
So those are a couple of things that we can introduce in this segment to give an idea about what we're looking for in the archaeological record. So since we have a little bit of time here, we can begin to introduce the 15th century destruction for a moment, and then we'll finish that up. So both of them found in the late Bronze Age, so this is about 1550 to 1400, okay, that's sort of the range period. Both of them found evidence for destruction of a city. So this would be around the time of Joshua. We're talking about the period of the conquest. So Yadin found some really interesting discoveries of destruction in several areas, in area H, A, and F. These were what he designated as part of his archaeological reports. The destruction of a temple, which is a cultic place of worship. We're going to talk about the significance of that. Yes. The temple was located in what was called Area H, and this was at the northern tip of the lower part of the city. We'll show that up on the screen. And this other temple in the upper area, in Area A, was also destroyed. So somebody came into the city and deliberately targeted temples.
Yes.
So that's interesting. Why would they do that? These are the questions that arise. Who is it? Why would they do it? What kind of motivation do they have? Can we discern that from historical records? Can't discern that from the archaeology itself. It doesn't tell us who did it. It doesn't tell us why they did it. But why would they target these particular areas of Hatzor? And then Ben-Tur found evidence of what he called Area M, which is the transition between the lower and the upper city. That's the area that I participated in 2007. He found evidence, particularly in the year 2000, of destruction in Area M from the 15th century BC. And we'll get into that a little bit more. We have an extensive quote from Ben-Tur, which we'll show in our next segment. But the point of this is we say, the Bible says, the city was destroyed in the 15th century. We have two Israeli archaeologists saying there's destructions of Hatzor, a destruction, I should say, in both the lower and upper part of the city, 15th century BC. So if it looks like a duck and it walks like a duck, we say maybe it's a duck.
Right.
Right?
The evidence
in the next
is there.
segment, we'll talk about that.
That's right. The evidence is there. It's very clear. And so once again, archaeology is our friend in understanding the biblical text.
Yeah.
Well, we will be right back to continue our conversation about biblical Hatzor.
In a culture of intense Bible-denying skepticism, Associates for Biblical Research exists to strengthen followers of Jesus by affirming the authority of the Bible. Our archaeological fieldwork and original research form a strong foundation in upholding the reliability of the Scriptures. For students or anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible, please visit our website and partner with us by joining our prayer team or financially supporting this ministry. And thank you for standing with us.
Welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm here today with my co-host Henry Smith, and we're having a fascinating discussion about biblical Hatzor. We've looked at the biblical evidence. We looked at Joshua 10 and 11 in our previous episode, and today we're talking about the archaeological evidence. We're kind of putting the pieces together, so to speak. And so, Henry, let's continue that discussion of that archaeological evidence. I know we just got started in the first segment. Let's continue.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So we were talking about both Yadin and Ben-Tur found evidence of a 15th century BC destruction. Now, they seem to date, Ben-Tur particularly, dates Joshua's conquest to the 13th century. Yeah, so they didn't correlate the 15th century destruction with the account in Joshua. But we do, because we believe the biblical text points to the 15th century, not a later period. So that's just a point of clarification.
And
yes.
It might be helpful, Henry, I'm just kind of springboarding here with that. Why would he date it to the 13th century? I have a suspicion there were some scholarly assumptions going on with
Yeah, and it has to do with your understanding of the biblical text and where the archaeology, how the archaeology relates to it, and which, at the bottom of it, you have to decide from your method which has more weight, which is more authoritative, if you want to say, the text or the archaeology, and which tells you the more explicit story, and which do you trust more, and what do you believe about the nature of the text and all that. So there's a lot that goes into that. And in fact, we had a series of 4 episodes with Dr. Stripling that talked about why the 13th century Exodus doesn't work, Exodus conquest, and why the 15th century one is the more valid biblically grounded and archaeological date that we should follow.
Yes.
So we want to encourage our viewers to watch those episodes because they're extremely important. They tie into what we're talking about today.
That's right.
So, but along those lines, I want to read this quote from Ben Tor, who does not subscribe to a 15th century know exactly who this invader is. But this is what he says. The earlier phase, meaning the 15th century, ended in a fire. Now that's what's recorded in the book of Joshua. Similar to the one that brought the later phase to an end, 13th century. So he's talking about a later destruction, which we would correlate with Judges. We'll talk about that in a bit. The pottery associated with this earlier phase, even though it's meager, which means he didn't have a lot of it, seems to place the date somewhere in the late Bronze I period, aka 15th century BC, the time of Joshua. This destruction is most probably contemporary with the end of stratum 2 in the lower city. Now that's what Yadin called in the lower city, stratum 2. Ben Tor is talking about area M, the transition between the lower and the upper city. So he's correlating these 2 destructions, which is really one destruction in these 2 different sections of the city. It's really fascinating.
Yeah.
So, and we have pictures from our friend Doug Petrovich, Dr. Doug Petrovich, I should say, from the Bible Seminary, who wrote an extensive article on Hatzor. He's got great pictures of the burn line from the LB1 period. We'll show those to our audience, and we should give Doug props for that. He's written a great amount of work on that. And an article that was published over 10 years ago, we have it on the ABR website, that lays out the evidence for Hatzor in an incredible way. So that's sort of the summary of the 15th century argument and the evidence from Hatzor.
Okay. Well, it's very, very important. The archaeological evidence has to be brought together with the biblical material.
Yes.
And I think Henry, for some of our viewers out there, that they know we are committed to the Bible, and we never use the archaeology to interpret the Bible.
Right.
The Bible is our starting point. Sometimes we still get people who write and say, "Hey, you're using the archaeology to understand the Bible."
Yeah.
But that is not our approach. But what's really interesting is, as we look at the Bible and we look at the archaeological evidence, we're looking at that and we're saying, we need to understand the archaeological evidence properly. The scholarly world is often moving the chronologies around. They're always moving the chronologies. And of course, if you do that, you set up a contradiction with the biblical accounts. So maybe you could just say a little bit more about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, again, this goes back to a lot of times to the theory of the development of the Old Testament. That these accounts were written later, and that they were redacted, and they were edited, and they were changed in such a way that you can't derive a coherent chronology from them. And therefore, what you determine from archaeology sort of brings control over the text. And our method is, no, the archaeology is extremely important, but it doesn't serve as the master of the text. It serves in a ministerial fashion. Now, that's a methodological approach. We believe it's justified. Oftentimes, the skeptics or more liberal scholars, they don't justify their methodology.
Right.
They just assume that it's correct. But we would say that our argument is a better argument. That's what we would say in the end.
Yeah, and ultimately they're entering into the discussion with the presumption that the Bible isn't accurate.
That's
so
right.
they don't use the Bible.
Yes.
So it's very interesting when we are criticized for believing the Bible, and yet the archaeological evidence, carefully interpreted, supports the biblical text, certainly at Hatzor.
Yes.
This discussion of these burn levels and the dating technology is so important. The interpretation of the data has to come down very, very carefully on the evaluation of the evidence.
That's right. Yeah, that's a good way to sum it up. And so as we consider that, as we move towards the end of this segment, we're going to talk next about the 13th century destruction, because this is very interesting. We have, as I mentioned numerous times, the defeat of the king in Judges 4, but it doesn't say that the city was destroyed. And yet the city was destroyed in the archaeological record. We're going to talk about that. Now, our friend Scott Stripling has suggested maybe an alternative. Maybe it was someone else. Maybe it was Pharaoh Merneptah who destroyed the city. That's a possibility, because the Bible doesn't demand that the city was destroyed. Personally, I leaned at this point towards the destruction being correlated with Judges 4. It is not inconsistent with it. And in our next segment, we're going to... And they're associated with the 13th century destruction is even more clear evidence that I think is consistent with an Israelite attack on the city. So let's go right into that. Let's read from Yadin's excavation report. He writes, concerning the lower city, the end of stratum 1A came about as a result of a violent fire. And in the upper city, he says the total destruction was evident in all excavated areas. He calls this stratum 13 is what he refers to it as. The conclusion is the city was clearly destroyed in the 13th century BC. And we can certainly logically correlate that with Deborah and Barak's defeat over Jabin and his general Sisera. So, and during what's really fascinating about this is not only evidence for fire, in some places several feet thick, which we have actual pictures of, both pictures that we have and our friend Doug Petrovich has taken photos of. But we find the explicit desecration of statues and cultic implements, and this is really fascinating, Scott. The reason it's fascinating is we find in Deuteronomy this command from the Lord to destroy all their idols, if I could summarize it that way. So the Israelites go into the land and they're commanded, destroy these images of these false gods, which from the biblical standpoint, in the ultimate sense, are demonically inspired. In the big, in the big picture, it doesn't say that in the text, in the immediate sense, but the ultimate reason for these false gods is they're false. They come from Satan. They're satanic. And so they move people away from worshiping the true God. So God commands them to destroy them. And at Hatzor, Ben-Tur and Yadin found evidence of cultic objects where the heads were chopped off deliberately. One, this beautiful statue where the face was smashed in. It was deliberately broken, found in the 13th century BC destruction. And we have great pictures of those we're going to show to the audience. Just explicit evidence of deliberate desecration of these cultic objects. It's indicative of the Israelites' obedience to God's command in Deuteronomy. So when you take the fact that Deborah and Barak defeat the king, and even though the text doesn't say they destroyed Hatzor, the desecration of the cultic objects really fits with Israelites' obedience. There's an Egyptian statue that was not only smashed, but chiseled deliberately. Somebody didn't just knock it over and knock the head off or whatever the case may be, but they chiseled it as if to try to erase it.
Yeah.
It's really fascinating.
Yeah, it is interesting. So Henry, just for our viewers today,
yes,
there's evidence of two different fires.
Correct.
From two different time periods. And
right.
we want to make sure people understand that's the kind of thing we look at very carefully in archaeology.
Yes.
Because this evidence can be mistaken. And misdated.
I think as it relates to the Bible, it's interesting because what you have is the Joshua account, the Judges account, and in the archaeology, it's very interesting. After the Judges period, shortly thereafter, there's evidence of an Israelite occupation in the early Iron period
Yeah.
So now that's not reported in the Bible, but what it does is compresses the whole thing into whatever theory you're coming up with. You've got to explain these destructions.
Yes.
How do you explain them? Well, I would submit that the biblical text explains them better than any other theory that's out there.
Very good, very good.
And so I think that is another way that we can approach it. Okay, if not the Bible's explanation, give us a better model.
Yes.
And I haven't exactly seen one that fits quite as well as what the biblical text seems to fit with the evidence.
Yes, yes. Well, let's talk in the time that remains related to the Bible from the conquest city of Hatzor.
Yes, sure. One thing I forgot to add that I'd like to augment with, and then I'll go with that, is they found there an occupational gap in the archaeological record between the 15th and the 13th century BC. Okay, so, and we have a picture of that. A meter and a half of just dirt that's sort of covered over the site with no evidence of occupation, no pottery, no architecture, no nothing, just sort of evidence of nobody being there. Well, the Bible doesn't say that nobody lived there between the Joshua and the Judges period, but that makes sense.
Yes.
Joshua destroyed the city, the Canaanites rebuilt the city, then during the Judges period, it was destroyed again, and then the Israelites occupied the city. That's what the archaeology sort of shows. So the occupational gap in the archaeological record fits the 160-year gap recorded in the Bible.
Yes.
How about that?
Yeah.
So in summary, we have a prominent city described in the Bible. There it is. We have ancient texts that say Hatzor. There it is. There it is in the text. There it is in the archaeology. We have destructions of the city, too, correlate very nicely with the chronology of the Bible and the descriptions found in the Bible. So when we sum that all up, we say again, okay, if the Bible's not accurately recording it, give us a better answer. Give us a better reason for these destructions. And this book of Joshua is referred to as the head of all those kingdoms.
Right.
And in the Amarna letters, I think it's the only place where, if I remember this right, or maybe this is in a biblical text, you have to correct me, that the king is referred to as not as just the king of Hatzor, but the king of Canaan.
Right.
Right? Is that in the biblical
That's in the
text?
biblical
It's in the biblical text. So it shows you how, and it's a huge site. It's important. It's huge. It's like 200 acres. I think
Right.
The guy who was excavating it told us that it would take 600 years to excavate the whole site. That's how big it is. Only Jerusalem is bigger in terms of acreage.
Right.
So it's extremely important.
It's massive, and when we look there, do we see evidence of the conquest? There are two destruction layers at Hatzor, and it's very easy to remember because one is what they call stratum 15, and one is stratum 13. And we've been discussing the 15th century and the 13th century.
Yeah.
Well, guess what? What's stratum 15, stratum in the upper city, stratum 2 in the lower city. But stratum 15 dates to the 15th century. Stratum 13 in the upper city
That's so interesting.
Dates to the 13th century. Okay,
Yeah.
so we have two destruction layers, which makes perfect sense. Now, the attempt to assign stratum 13 to Joshua, you can see why that's problematic. May very well have been Maranatha who destroyed that, or
Deborah and Barak.
Deborah and Barak, if you
Judges
prefer
4.
that.
Yeah.
You have the famous desecration of the cultic area there, the decapitation of these idols. That's in that stratum 13. But this could have any foreign
Sure.
invasion could have done such a thing.
For the Deborah and Barak argument, it's consistent with the command, destroy all their idols.
Yes.
So it's consistent with the data. Because Judges 4, just to clarify, does not say specifically that Deborah and Barak destroyed Hatzor.
Right.
They defeated the king. So it could be implied, but it's not stated.
Right.
Right.
And it very well could be the case.
Yeah.
And it could also be someone else like Maranatha. But regardless, it's important that we see these two destruction layers. So if the stratum 15 is the destruction from the time of Joshua, then that means that the second destruction layer could be assigned to either Maranatha or Deborah and Barak, for example.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's important. We're talking about the conquest evidence as it helps us to understand the early date of the Exodus. And I would want our viewers to understand that, well, first of all, with Mount Ebal, we are really hoping to get back there, and well, we'd love to get there and do some work on that earlier altar that's there. But we worked for years, of course, at Kerben el-Makader, we believe is the biblical city of Ai. Henry's dug at Hatzor. Dr. Wood's research on Jericho was groundbreaking research. So we have really put the time in here to try to understand the chronologies related to these great historic sites, and we're going to continue that work in the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
I want to add to that just really quick, a really important point, that in the skeptical or minimalist literature and academic arguments, the origin of the nation of Israel is not from the conquest, meaning in the land. There's other theories. Sure. There's all these different theories. So the importance of the conquest is tied directly to the Exodus, because the Exodus story leads to it. If the conquest didn't really happen, then that just has a domino effect backwards to the Exodus. So, and the Exodus is the central event of Old Testament history, if I could say that way, and it affects our theology of the New Testament. I mean, all the connections are pretty obvious, but so the importance of this can't be overstated, really, in terms.
لا تنسوا الاعجاب بالفيديو والاشتراك في القناة.